In this video I'm playing in the round 1 of 2022 Summer 1v1 Risk Elo tournament with the 13th ladder opponent Arco, with myself starting from the 9th position. We will be playing 4 games on United States World Domination and 4 games on Simple World Caps. Each of us has to go first and second the same amount of times on both of the maps. This is how our manual setup looked at the first round. And my opponent didn't have one ideal place to put his army to, where he would be accessible to all of my potential hiding spots. My opponent didn't end up predicting my army, so then he went on capturing as many territories as possible. It was my turn and I had to decide which pathing to select. And the most ideal one would have going like that, like the arrows show. But for some reason I decided to start invading my opponent from the left side continent, so I had to do that troop split here, which was terrible, as ideally you would like to capture the territories in a straight line, and also as you saw I've got unlucky to lose 3 troops when attacking my opponent's army of 2 troops. All in all, everything led me running out of troops when reaching the last opponent's continents, and that pathing mistake with a bad blitz roll cost me the game. As well as with me not risking the 5 versus 3 blitz roll over here. I forgot that my opponent had 3 troops on that border. After the first game the result becomes 0-1 with my opponent being in the lead. This is how the manual setup looked in the second game, and with my opponent selecting a bunch of territories in the middle, he completely blocked himself the path from one side to another. I wasn't sure where my opponent is going to add his troops to, so I decided to place my army in the left side, as placing my troops to that territory I had the access to all of the left side territories. And my opponent decided to do the 2 army split in the right side of the map. So with that I was just going to leave my armies in the right side blocked, while capturing those continents, so at least I would hold the most left one. And while my opponent got good 5v4 manual roll, winning it even when it came down to 3v2, he still couldn't invade my last continent with me having that additional 3 troops army. So then my opponent went on capturing as many territories as possible with his main armies, and then in my turn I did the same. I fortified 2 troops in this continent so to decrease the likelihood of it being invaded, and then I didn't waste these 3 troops attacking territories, as one thing I already had a lot of them, and another thing is that those 3 troops really helped to protect that left side continent when my opponent had to invade me into my 2 other continents as well. With having to do the troop splits, my opponent managed to invade me only into 2 of my continents, and with that it wasn't possible for him to make a comeback. The result after the second game becomes 1-1 with us being in tie. This is how the manual setup looked in the third round. And with me putting my army to that place, I was accessible to all of my opponent's territories except these 2, but if he had put his army to either of them, then I would have just simply left it blocked and he would have immediately lost. So with my opponent putting his army close to that my army spot, I had even 87% chance to blitz his army successfully, and with me getting a very good attacker's advantage, it wasn't possible for my opponent to make a comeback. With him ending his turn, besides me ending up with 22 territories, I had also an army of 4 troops. The result after 3 games 2-1 with me now being in the lead. This is how our manual setup looked in the 4th round. And with my opponent selecting a lot of territories in the middle, he blocked himself the access from one side of the map to another, while for myself that path was open. I could have placed my army to either in right side, or one of the 3 left side places, and taking all of that into account, I would guess that my opponent probably had like only 33% chance to predict my army, and unfortunately to me he did. With taking 93% chance blitz, he got a very good attacker's advantage, and with that the game was immediately lost for me. The result after 4 games becomes 2-2 with us being in a draw for the second time. Moving on to the Simple World Caps, this is how our manual setup looked in the 5th game. And I decided to put my capital army on Scandinavia and my secondary army on Western Australia, while my opponent decided to put all of his troops in one single capital army on mainland Europe. My opponent in his turn captured North America, and I in my turn took over it, as well as capturing Australia with South America with my secondary army. My opponent successfully invaded me into North America but failed to break through South America, and then he fortified a large stack of troops away from his capital. And I saw that adding 6 troops on my secondary army I wouldn't have a bigger army than my opponent getting to his secondary army, and I knew that if I add my troops on my capital and then attack my opponent's secondary army with it, and at the end fortifying my secondary army on my capital, then my capital would have become totally isolated. But I should have taken one of these options anyway, probably the first one, as if I had been lucky to not lose troops when capturing the territories of ones, then it would have been 19 versus 19 attack. But without me doing that, my opponent got to take the attacker's advantage, losing 2 troops fewer when attacking my army of 3, and then crushing my secondary army with even 4 troops attacker's advantage, as well as before getting successful to break through North America in a 5v5 scenario. But that might have still not been that bad enough if I hadn't ended up in a very blocked position in which it was starting to get hard to invade my opponent into his continents, and right here my opponent ended up holding Australia. Right here, after trading in a set, I saw that I have another wild card, so instead of going to manual roll his capital, I decided to continue playing to hope to that with my opponent recapturing the continents and wasting his capital's troops my odds will quite increase. But my opponent got lucky to have a set at 3 cards as well, and he was smart to trade it in, so I didn't end up getting that opportunity. But at least I've got good manual rolls to recapture North America. So I continued playing aggressively, hoping that my opponent will get to leave his capital quite weak. And probably my best chance to do the manual rolls would have been here. And then I had another chance in the next turn as well before my opponent trade in a set. But I didn't do the math what percentage blitz roll my opponent was going to get combining his capital's troops with his newly gotten troops along with the troops from the cards, so I missed those last hope opportunities, and my opponent got the 89% chance to blitz my capital successfully, and with that he won the game. After 5 games the result becomes 2-3 with my opponent getting into the lead. This is how our manual setup looked in the 6th round. I put one of my armies on the Guianas and another army on China, so to prepare my opponent holding one border Europe, as it was very obvious that he was going to go for it. And my opponent put his capital army on Scandinavia like predicted, and his secondary army on Central America, so then I obviously capped on the Guianas. My opponent ended up completely blocking all of his troops from my armies, so then I took over South America, Africa and Australia with only having 2 borders to guard, as well as I invaded my opponent into North America. Right here I intended to card block my opponent, but actually these 9 troops weren't enough, so I think it would have been better if I had fortified my Central America army of 12 troops on China, but probably doing that split even bigger than 12 troops, leaving my capital quite weaker. But luckily enough my opponent still didn't get lucky manual rolls on the 9v9 attack. But then he fortified a lot of troops out of his capital, and I didn't have big enough army to crush it, so I ended up doing manual rolls, but I should have really used my army on United States to do manual rolls with it, and then potentially crush my opponent's army on Russia with my army on China. But that didn't happen, and right here my opponent got even 8 troops attacker's advantage on my secondary army. So I really ended up misplaying with what I did instead, and I barely had any chances to win anymore. My opponent got lucky manual rolls to immediately take over my capital after breaking through my continents, but even if he hadn't, when I asked he said he had 12 troops on his cap, so the game would have been lost for me either way. After 6 games the result becomes 2-4 with my opponent increasing his lead. This is how our manual setup looked in the 7th round. And my opponent put his capital army on North Africa, while his secondary army on the Guianas. While I put my troops to one big army on Middle East while actually capping on mainland Europe. And first of all I think that was a mistake for me in the territory selection to let my opponent pick North Africa while I could easily prevent it of happening if I had chosen it here instead of China. As based on my previous experience, North Africa is the best counter spot in the set of blizzards. So anyway, in my turn I captured Asia with Australia, without capturing Europe, as for some reason I thought it would be a bad move, but I was absolutely wrong on that. As with my opponent capturing and properly guarding South America, he was the first one to receive extra troops. So with realizing that I captured Europe in my second turn as well as capturing Greenland and fortifying my army on Canada so to reduce my opponent's mobility by a little bit. But then my opponent went with his master plan to properly guard Africa with Australia when with me not having access to these borders with my main army. But luckily the dice was in my favor, so with getting a good attacker's advantage I not only broke through both of those continents, but also captured Australia. My opponent then intended to go for the same plan again, but with me fortifying those 4 troops on China instead of to my capital back, my opponent this time didn't have enough troops to properly guard those continents. And then I decided to capture the territory of United States to fully capture North America and then fortify that army to Africa, as to fortify some troops from my capital would have been risky. And I needed to capture the territory of United States so my opponent would be forced to unleash the way towards South America to me after him invading me into Europe. And all in all it looked like everything went very well, that I was in a really dominating position. My opponent after trading an A set only had 7% chance to blitz my capital, so he went for manual rolls so for true random odds which looking to the calculator were around 22%, but he managed to get very lucky manual rolls, and switching back to blitz option he increased his chance to 44%, and unfortunately that coin flip went unsuccessfully for me. My opponent won, and the result after 7 games becomes 2-6 with my opponent being in the unstoppable lead which I cannot even tie. This is how our manual setup looked in the 8th round and my opponent put his secondary army on British Isles while his capital army on the Guianas. And I put capital army on mainland Europe while my secondary army on Central America. In my turn I crushed my opponent's secondary army getting the attacker's advantage of 4 troops. And then I captured North America so to make a way to fortify my army to the capital. And my opponent in his turn came with a very smart play to capture and properly guard North America, so probably it wasn't the best idea for me to fortify absolutely all of the troops to my capital. I failed my attempt to invade my opponent into North America and I think I made a mistake here by going fully with my main army to invade my opponent into his continents, as if I had just split some troops. Then at the end I would have been able to fortify some troops on Russia so to improve my chances breaking into North America. Then my opponent captured all of those continents, and I think it was a mistake for me to go through North Africa, as at the end it made me blocked from my opponent's capital, so I think going with it I should have probably taken the 25 versus 7 capital blitz roll. It was 100% but since there were 3 rounds from the beginning of the game passed, I decided not to take it because I was afraid of losing a lot of troops. But anyway, right here after trading an A set I've got a bad blitz roll to invade my opponent into North America, and then a bad one to invade my opponent into Australia too, so I think I should have rather used all of my troops to invade North America. Anyway, then with me capturing all of those continents my opponent went through North Africa to invade all of them with his capital army unleashing my way towards it, and I could have taken the 89% chance blitz roll. But I decided not to because I thought that one border Europe is very OP, and my opponent won't be so lucky to hold North America every time. Trading in a set at 3 cards I invaded it, but with my opponent having a set at 3 card he got lucky to recapture it again. And my opponent was very smart to not unleash my capital's way towards him by not attacking through North Africa, but luckily I've got the access to North America. And right here I made a mistake here by splitting too many troops because I forgot whether my opponent had some troops in the bottom African territory or not. But despite that with my opponent getting lucky to trade in a set at 3 cards, he still had only 10% chance to blitz my capital which switching to manual rolls for true random odds were around 24%, but the manual rolls were very favorable for him again and with switching to the blitz option he had even 74% chance. In the end I was even very surprised myself that he still lost. The final result becomes 3-6 with my opponent winning the series. Here's the end of the first round, and my opponent from the 13th place ranked up to the 6th, and I from the 9th place ranked down to the 25th place. Now if you're interested in checking out the full tournament series, then click on the playlist at the top left, and if you're interested in watching more 1v1 competitions in general, then click on the playlist at the bottom left.